1834, 3 years before Samuel Cox came to his new position at First Church, his life had been threatened by a racist mob and his house had been ransacked. Cox was the minister of the Lake Street Church in Manhattan, where his abolitionist views were well known. In the spring and summer of 1834, violent anti-abolitionist riots sprang up throughout the city. The disturbances lasted for days as men armed with clubs went searching out the homes of Black residents and abolitionists, taking their property and throwing it into the street. He would later describe the scene.
I have seen reason to espouse the cause of emancipation and to oppose slavery in our country as an evil of combined and terrible enormities. And this is the occasion of outrage and fury, mobbing my house and thirsting for my blood. What grieved me much was to see so many ministers of the gospel engaged in the matter, inspiring, countenancing, and endorsing the outrages of the mob.
He left a year later to join the faculty at the Theological Seminary in Auburn, New York. He taught there for 2 years before accepting the call to First Church. Unlike his youthful predecessors at First Presbyterian, Samuel Cox was middle-aged when he became pastor. He and his large family moved into a house at 80 Henry Street.
He was considered a man of dazzling intelligence who spoke with an eloquence drawn from a religious classical training. His sermons and lectures were often laced with Latin or Greek aphorisms. Some he translated into rhymed couplets. Along with having a sharp wit and a practiced oratorical speaking style, he was also considered a bit eccentric.
He wore a hat with the word Golgotha pasted on the inside of the brim. When people asked the purpose of it, he would explain simply that it meant the place of the skull.
His erudition and popularity as a speaker excited his congregation at First Presbyterian. No one could doubt his sincerity or the high level of his discourse. But his liberal interpretation of his calling, along with his abolitionist convictions, were unpopular with the conservative members of his church, the old school Presbyterians.
He was only newly installed when he found himself thrust into an explosive debate that would shatter First Church and its session. It became so acrimonious that certain session members broke off from the church and accused Cox and his followers of seceding. The old school was officially recognized by the Presbytery of Manhattan. At the same time, the new Presbytery of Brooklyn was formed, to which Cox's church became a new member.
The old school pulled nearly 100 of Cox's congregation into its new branch and announced a new minister, then built its own church on the corner of Clinton and Remsen Streets and maintained that it was the one and only First Presbyterian Church. For approximately 30 years, there were not one, but 2 First Presbyterian churches of Brooklyn. Divisions like this occurred throughout the country. As one newspaper described it, the Presbyterian Church is like a hickory stick. It's useful, but it can split easily.
The schism was not just a doctrinal break. It also carried the old school alignment with slavery on one side and new school abolitionism on the other. 19th century Brooklyn had other powerful advocates against slavery among its clergy, including the charismatic minister Henry Ward Beecher, who had been invited to Brooklyn by a Congregationalist community and who said he would come when they had a church for him.
Cox's membership recovered from its initial absconders and grew to 838 people by the year 1846. It was time to move. The brick church was sold for $20,000 to the newly formed Plymouth Church. Meanwhile, construction was underway to accommodate Cox's parishioners with a new and larger church building on Henry Street. To commemorate the event, Cox wrote several verses that were placed in a small container in the new church's cornerstone.
By thy kind blessing would we raise a goodly temple to thy praise. We come, behold the work begun. We come to lay the cornerstone.
Within its bosom now we place these few mementos of thy grace, whose import coming time may learn, or which earth's conflagrations burn.
Should generations yet unborn behold from this foundation torn, These brief memorials they shall own, we build in Christ the cornerstone.
And now, thou sacred one in three, ourselves we consecrate to thee. And when on earth our work is done, be thou, O Christ, our cornerstone.
Samuel Cox believed that science and humanity and religion are all kindred and harmonious. Christianity favors them all. His commitment to higher education included co-founding what would later be called New York University. His personal love for learning extended to the study of astronomy, and he was the co-organizer and first president of the Brooklyn Astronomical Society. One night, while seated at the platform to welcome a visiting astronomer to Brooklyn, Cox learned that the speaker had suddenly taken ill and could not give the lecture. Cox was approached and asked if he could possibly say something to the audience that sat in front of him.
He rose to the podium, apologized for his amateur understanding of the subject matter, then proceeded to speak extemporaneously for 45 minutes. Listeners were shocked at what one would describe as a brilliant feat.
Meanwhile, as the path towards civil war seemed inevitable and terrifying in Cox's divided nation, the vehemence of his abolitionism seemed to falter. He argued that while he hated slavery, he was first and foremost an American who believes in keeping his country united, even when its preservation relied on odious laws. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it mandatory to return enslaved people who had escaped. There were severe legal consequences for those who hid or helped fugitives in their flight. Cox equivocated over whether one could break this federal law.
Why didn't Cox challenge this act? Perhaps it was the fear of a civil war that he shared with so many Americans, a fear he had unwittingly predicted in the cornerstone of his new church that pitted his faith against a war where Earth's conflagrations burn. But despite the efforts of Cox and others to bend their morals to fit the law, their compromises did not succeed. The war would come a decade later.
Samuel Hanson Cox left the pulpit of his church in 1854 because of chronic laryngitis and moved upstate, where he lived until his death in 1880. Prior to his leaving Brooklyn, he had lived on the street that would later be named in his honor, Hanson Place.
He was a man of many turns, eccentric, spirit-guided, at times courageous, and at times confounding.
The Brooklyn Eagle compared Cox to a meteor that shines brightly before fading away against the stars. It would describe the departure of this uniquely American pastor.
One of the most brilliant intellects of the American pulpit has passed into another sky.